All right, so hey everybody. The purpose of this video, we're going to take a look at the progressive era, at how it deals with the racial tensions that are going on in the country during the early part of the 20th century, specifically in regards to Jim Crow laws in the South and how this is going to impact the life of African Americans. Kind of a spoiler on this one, there's not a whole lot of progress that's going to be made here in the progressive era, but it is, like we've seen in some of the other topics we've come to, there is going to be the groundwork laid here for debates and discussions that are going to impact future generations as we go through the 20th century. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the development of the New South and the problem of race. We talked about how Southern inequality was a definite development going through the late 19th, going into the 20th century, both in voter suppression and with Jim Crow laws and with violence, specifically in the form of Southern lynchings. I think where the focus really comes in here, as we look at the progressive era, kind of centers around the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which we talked about briefly a couple of weeks ago, but we're going to hit a little bit more detail in right here. The Plessy in this case is Homer Plessy. He was an African American. Actually, he was 1/8 black. So he did not, in appearance, if you didn't know he was African American, you might not assume that he was. But in New Orleans in 1896, he decided that it was, as part of a civil disobedience movement, he decided it was appropriate to get into a white train car in the city of New Orleans, and this was going to violate the Louisiana Separate Car Act, which is part of the Jim Crow laws that are going on in Louisiana and kind of across the southern states. The law said that there were separate rail cars for white riders and for black riders. And when Plessy boarded the train, he had his ticket and he declared himself to be African American, and so he was subsequently arrested. The Ferguson in the case is the district attorney in New Orleans that is prosecuting the case. And as it goes through the courts, it is eventually going to make its way up to the Supreme Court, because it's clear that Plessy has violated this law. But the question really gets to be, is this law itself a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? The 14th Amendment, in part, guarantees equal protection and equal application of the law to all Americans. And the question here is, does the sheer existence of a segregation law violate that equal protection? Because it is establishing separate rules for separate groups of people. When the Supreme Court makes its ruling in this case, it is a 7-1 decision for the protection of the law, of that segregation law. And what the majority decision says is that, under Jim Crow laws, the establishment of separate but equal facilities maintains the notion of that equal protection clause. So segregation laws are considered to be constitutional. This is getting into the equality of the existence of the facilities, but really kind of begs the point, ignores the point about the quality that's being provided. And so the 7-1 decision is a clear indication of what the federal government's stance is in the 1890s in regards to equality between the races. But it is worth pointing out that one justice that is speaking in dissent, that is Justice Harlan, Justice Harlan in his dissent is going to give his opinion about what this really should be meaning. And it is Harlan's dissent that is going to kind of have some echoes as you look through later generations of civil rights, the civil rights movement. He says that the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country. But in view of the Constitution and the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizen. our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. He is taking that idea of equality, equal protection under the law, and expanding the notion of it, because he says in respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. And he argues that anything that is going to serve as a challenge to, well, that equality, single law applying to all citizens equally, he says that that is a violation of the Constitution. He is the lone voice in the Supreme Court that is echoing this idea here in 1896, but these are ideas that are going to reverberate through the next generations of civil rights, well, the civil rights movement and civil rights activists. Here during the Progressive Era, the two, I guess, dominant figures in terms of civil rights activists, there's W.E.B. Du Bois, but there's Booker T. Washington. You all have some familiarity with Booker T. Washington and the Atlanta Compromise speech through the book study that we did at the beginning of the semester, but it's worth pointing out a couple of things here. In the Atlanta Compromise speech, which he gives a year before the Plessy decision, so he's not really able to react to the law of the land as the Supreme Court kind of puts it out there, that separate but equal is okay. But Washington's speech is an accommodating speech, accommodationist speech, where maybe in the temporary here and now segregation can be okay. And then through the course of time, as African Americans are able to increase their economic standing and their social standing through their economic growth, that in turn can lead to greater levels of political equality under the law. One of the more vocal advocates, or one of the more vocal opponents of this view by Booker T. Washington is W.E.B. Du Bois. And every time I say his name, I can hear people tell me that I'm saying it wrong. He pronounced his last name Du Bois, not Dubois. So Du Bois, he is a little bit more of a direct proponent of other actions needed to try to push the issue of equal civil rights in the short term. So in 1903, he starts an organization called the Niagara Movement because of where it was in upper state New York. Du Bois is the first African American to graduate from Harvard University, and so he is from a different background from Booker T. Washington. Du Bois was never in slavery, but he is seeing the distinction and the segregation and the damage that segregation is doing to the African American community, and he is a strong proponent of some type of progressive era organizational effort to try to achieve that political equality. And so he is one of the founding members of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. When it's established in 1909, they are dedicated to the proposition that Jim Crow segregation laws are a violation of civil rights, and that the only way to undo those laws is to go through a series of litigations, taking things to court, and in the long run, nonviolent protests. I think the nonviolent protests are going to be more of a thing when we get past the world wars, because the level of violence towards African Americans it's still pretty strong here in the progressive era going into the 1920s. But what you are seeing is an increased set of legal actions being taken by the NAACP, challenging segregation laws most consistently where it deals with education. Because while Booker T. Washington understands that education can be an entry point to greater equality economically and socially, Du Bois understands that the way that the segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, are going to treat African American education is that equality may never be achievable given the differences in the educational opportunities. So this is definitely, like we've seen in some other topics, an issue that is going to be continued once we get on the other side of World Wars I and II and well into the 20th and 21st century. But this is the beginning of the modern debate about civil rights in this country.